Good afternoon. It's Brian Manning. I'm a political asylum lawyer. My law firm's called Manning Asylum Law, and we help people all over the country to secure their future in the United States through asylum. I used to be an asylum officer with the government. That means I was the person who did the asylum interviews and made a decision on whether people got asylum or not. But now I work as an asylum lawyer, which means that I'm advocating for people. I'm helping people put together the strongest case possible to show the asylum officer or the judge in immigration court exactly why they deserve and are eligible for asylum. So that's what we do. And we're based out of Houston, Texas, but we help people all over the country. So I want to go over one thing for just a couple of minutes, and then I'm going to open it up and take your questions. So go ahead, start putting your questions in the comment box. We're live on both Facebook and YouTube, and I'm going to get to your questions in just a minute. But I want to tell you, well, first of all, tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what country you're from and where you're watching from in the comments. Thank you. Oh, nice. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate it. So what I want to talk about before I get to your questions is this. It's called the first, last, and worst framework. The first, last, and worst framework. What is that? Okay. At your asylum interview, if you've been harmed a lot of times, like if you've had a lot of problems and you've been attacked or had some serious problems that have been more than just a couple of times, like it's happened a lot to you, the officer may ask you, okay, how many times have you been harmed? And you may say something like, oh, too many to count, or like 20 or something like that. And well, they're not going to have time to talk about every single one of those at your asylum interview. It's just not feasible. So they have to decide, okay, which ones are we going to talk about? And asylum officers very often do the first, last, worst approach. What does that mean? They say, okay, we're going to talk about the first time that you were harmed, and we're going to talk about the last or most recent time that you were harmed. And we're going to talk about the worst time of the different times that you've been harmed. Which one was the worst? What time did they do like the worst things to you, or it was the scariest and just overall the worst? Okay. That's the three that they're going to focus on. And so they might have you list out, okay, what was the date of the first one? If you don't remember the date, tell me the month and the year. And then they'll say, what was the date for the last or most recent one? Tell me the month and the year. Same thing with the worst one. Now, those could be the same. The worst one could be the first one. It could be the last one. Or it could be one of them in the middle. But the point is that the officer wants probably to discuss these three and not the other ones. Why? Why do they want to know that? Well, they want to know when your problem started. Okay. They want to understand the context in which your problems arose. And the main reason for that is that this might tell them something about the motives for the people that are harming you. Why did they come and start targeting you for harm? The circumstances, all the details surrounding that first incident may give us a good idea of what their motives were. And why do they care about the motives? Well, remember, to get asylum, you have to show that the reason you're being persecuted or will be in the future is the fact that you possess one of the 5 protected characteristics, and that's why the bad guys want to harm you. What are the 5 protected characteristics, also called the 5 protected grounds? Your race, religion, nationality, political opinion, and something called membership in a particular social group. So that's why they often pick the first one for you to tell them about if you've got a lot of incidents of harm in your past. The last one, well, they want to know how long ago it was, and they want to get a good feel for just what happened most recently. Why? Because they're also assessing what might happen in the future. So usually it's not enough to win asylum just to show that you've been harmed bad in the past. There's a couple scenarios where you can get asylum based just on what's happened in the past without you having a well-founded fear of persecution in the future. But normally you do need to show, look, I'm at risk in the future. And getting information about your most recent problem, your most recent attack or incident of harm can help the officer to assess, okay, this person really is probably still in danger in the future. If something really bad happened to you really recently, then the officer is more likely to think that, yeah, it's going to happen again in the future, or something even worse may happen in the future. So that's why they want to know about the most recent one, or the last incident of harm. And so in this first, last, and worst framework, The worst means the worst incident of harm, the time they did the worst things to you or hurt you the worst. And the reason they really want to know about this is because this helps them to make a determination on the question of persecution. So a second ago, I talked about the 5 protected grounds. That has to do with something called nexus. To get asylum, you have to show the persecution is on account of one of these 5 protected grounds, but you also have to show that the harm is sufficiently severe to count as persecution. Just a little bit of harm, something that's not so bad, will not count as persecution. Okay. But the officer needs to assess, okay, how bad the things that have happened to this person, how bad are they? Under our laws and under court decisions that judges have made in the past, does this sound like the kind of thing that our laws would treat as harm that is so bad that it rises to the level of persecution? So that's why they want to know about the worst incident of harm, because it may get you over that persecution threshold. It may be enough, even by itself, for the officer to go, okay, that thing was really bad. That counts as persecution. And then they don't have to worry anymore about past persecution, at least. They don't have to analyze, okay, how bad were the other incidents of harm? If you have one incident of harm that is by itself sufficiently severe to count as persecution, then that ends the inquiry. The officer likes that. They like to know, okay, I checked that box in my asylum analysis. We're done with that. So that's why they ask you about the worst incident of harm. Now, remember, you can add different incidents of harm together and consider them cumulatively, like combine them all together, and that can get you over the persecution threshold. That can be harm considered all together that's bad enough to count as persecution. So that's why they do the first, last, and worst framework very often when they're interviewing you at your asylum interview. Now, you can actually use this proactively as an asylum applicant in the way that you craft your asylum application materials. And by that, I mean in your application form, the form I-589, the asylum application form, on the questions that ask about, okay, tell us what's happened in the past, you can say, I've been hurt more times than I can count, or I've been hurt many times, more than a dozen times. A few of them that stand out as particularly important to me were, and then you can talk about in like 1 or 2 sentences about the first, the most recent, and the worst one. But where I think it's really can be helpful to do this is in your declaration or personal statement that you submit with your asylum application. If you've been harmed a whole bunch, you don't want to spend 20 pages writing about each and every one of these. You've got to keep your declaration or your personal statement short. It's got to be concise. I think 3 pages of like single spaced lines is a good length. You definitely don't want to go more than 5, but I see it all the time. When I was an asylum officer with the government, I saw all the time that people would submit applications with a personal statement attached that was 20 pages long, 30 pages long, no joke. And that is counterproductive. That is not helpful to your case. So one of the ways when you're trying to narrow it down and you're trying to be concise and to say what you want to say in a small amount of space, just a few pages, you have to decide, okay, how am I going to do this? What am I going to focus on? I can't talk about everything. Well, a good approach could be to talk about the first, last, and worst incidents that you've suffered. So you could say something like, I've suffered a lot of harm. I want to tell you in this statement about just a few that stand out to me as particularly significant. The first time I was harmed was X, and you talk about it. You spend a couple paragraphs talking about it, and then I was harmed many times between that one and the last one, but the last one was on X date, and you talk about that for a couple paragraphs, and then you say these were really bad. However, there was one incident that stood out to me as particularly bad. The worst incident was on, you list when it happened, and you talk about that for 2 or 3 paragraphs. So the first, last, worst approach can be something you as the asylum seeker can use in your application materials as a way to be concise and to focus your declaration on things that the officer wants to know about and not droning on for 20 pages. Because when you do that, they're either not going to read it or they're just going to skim it so superficially that they're going to miss half of the stuff. It's not going to help you. And I can tell you also from experience as an asylum officer, now former asylum officer, when the officer opens up your case file and they see that your declaration is 25 pages long, they just go, ugh. It makes them mad at you. Okay. It makes them not like you. I know it shouldn't be that way, but you're making their life hard. You're making it hard for them to have to read through this 25 pages, which most of which will not actually be relevant to them. I know you think it's relevant, and I know it's important to you. I know that it's real and it matters to you. And I don't mean to take away from that or denigrate that at all. But I can tell you that what ends up happening is that people put a whole lot of things that don't help their asylum application, that the officer does not need to know about to make a decision in your asylum case. So if you've been harmed a bunch, consider the first last worst framework for telling your story. And even if you've already written your declaration, um, when you're thinking about and preparing for your interview, you want to be able to talk about all incidents of harm, but you should make sure that you really spend a lot of time reflecting on, thinking back on the first one, the most recent one, and the worst one, because there's a pretty decent chance that they'll ask you about it in that format at your asylum interview. So, as I said, for those of you who just joined recently, I'm Brian Manning, and I'm a political asylum lawyer, and we help immigrants who are all over the United States to secure their future in America through asylum. And so we're based in Houston, but we have clients all over, and we help clients all over: East Coast, West Coast, middle of the country, north, south, all over. So if you think that you might want to talk about your situation, give us a call. Where you can call us. The number is above, and it's also now right down below: 713-909-0401. Thank you for being with me, and for your questions. So we've got a few questions. So I'm going to go. We're live on Facebook and YouTube, and I want to address these questions. Some of them I'll highlight on the screen. So Med Rain says, hello, Mr. Brian. Hello again. Good to see you. Thanks for being with us. Okay, this is a good question. Med Rain says, what's the motive of this? AO stands for asylum officer. Asylum officer taking and keeping with them original document during the interview. Can you give some examples from when you were an AO that you took and kept original documents from the applicant? So, okay, so why do they do that? And what he means by this, or they mean by this, is that sometimes at your interview, the officer will say, oh, I saw that you submitted with your application materials a copy of this letter from this guy in support of your case. Do you have the original of that? Do you have the physical letter that they sent to the mail, through the mail to you? Do you have the envelope that it came in? Not just letters. This could be for anything that you submitted as part of your case, or other original documents like your passport and your driver's license, things like that. They do sometimes ask at the interview, say, oh, can I get the original? And they'll take it and they'll have it the whole interview. And usually at the end, they should remember to give it back to you. So why are they doing that? What are they doing? Well, sometimes they're doing, what the most common thing is that they're doing a fraud analysis. They might think that it's fraudulent, that you got some fake copied document, some doctor's report that's fake, or that shows that you've been harmed really bad, but it's fake. Or, it could be fake in any number of ways. And they suspect it, and they take the original because they want to examine it, because the officers themselves, they get a little bit of training about how to spot fraudulent documents. But there's also a unit at the asylum office and within USCIS. What the asylum office, they call this the Fraud Detection and National Security branch or unit, that is, just like the name sounds, trying to stop fraud and also stop help with national security by looking out for threats. So they have received more training than your normal asylum officer in trying to spot fake documents. And so they have some tools to do that as well. And so the officer may take them and then pass them along during your interview to the FDNS, Fraud Detection and National Security Unit, and they may be doing some analysis on your documents. The officers, they sometimes, even if they don't suspect that it's fraudulent, they just want to for some reason see the original, and there's not really a good reason for that, of which I'm aware. And to be honest with you, when I was an asylum officer, I hardly ever asked for the originals of things. But I wasn't someone who saw fraud under every rock. And by that I mean that many asylum officers, they think that everyone is lying to them. They think that there's fraud everywhere, when in reality, in my opinion, in my experience, both as an asylum officer and now as an asylum lawyer, it's not like that. It's not like everyone is lying and trying to pull one over on the asylum officer. But a lot of officers think that there's this culture within USCIS that tells you, oh, I should think everything is fraudulent. I got to be super suspicious of everything. I mean, being vigilant is one thing, right? Being careful, being thorough is great. But when this culture morphs into something else that says, I think they're all lying to me and I'm going to find them out, that's not healthy. It's not how our asylum system should be working. And there's a lot of officers that are like that, unfortunately. Oh, here's an interesting question. I've never seen this question before. Samson says, does attaching the personal statement with the I-589 make any difference on the time to be called for the interview? So like if you apply, and does it make a difference whether you attach the send in with it your statement, or send it in without a statement? Is one way going to get you your interview faster than the other way? The answer is no, doesn't make any difference. Not any difference at all. It's a good question, though. I've never seen that question asked, but it's a good question. It's a reasonable question to ask, but no, it doesn't make any difference. That has nothing to do with it. There's nothing that you could include or not include that will make a difference in terms of the timeline of getting your interview scheduled. Like the people who receive the applications and then schedule the interviews, like they're not interested in what you submitted, as long as you submitted the bare minimum requirements for USCIS to say, yes, we received this application and it's now in processing. As long as you submit the bare minimum, like beyond that, it doesn't matter to them what else you submit, and it will not affect how quickly you get your interview, depending on what else you submit. But good question. Oh man. So Jojo says, I did my interview last February 08, still pending. What if the results denied? What's my option if that's the case? Do you mean February 8th of last year, meaning a little over a year ago, or like a month ago? Or do you mean February of the year 2008? If it was February of 2008, you should sue the government, absolutely, to get your decision. But to address the other part of your question, what if it's denied? What's my option if that's the case? So basically, he's asking, what happens when asylum case is denied? Well, what happens next depends on your status at the moment that USCIS makes that negative decision. If at the moment that they're making that decision, well, what they do is they look in their systems and they figure out what your immigration status is at that moment. If you still have valid status at that moment, like let's say your tourist stay is still valid. Like when you came into the country, for example, they often give they say you can stay for 6 months. If you're still within that 6 months, then what happens is the asylum office issues what's called a notice of intent to deny, NOID, notice of intent to deny, NOID, and they call this a NOID, N-O-I-D, NOID for like if you were to sound out the acronym. And this NOID says, we intend to deny your application, and here's why. And they list the reasons. They kind of explain. It's usually not like a super in-depth, really good explanation, but they explain a little bit. And you have 16 days. They say you have 16 days to reply to us in writing and explain to us why we're wrong. Try to change our minds, okay? And so if you do that, well, after 16 days, if you haven't replied, then they send you a final denial letter and say you're denied. If you reply within those 16 days, they'll consider your arguments. Your rebuttal is what it's called. It's called a NOID rebuttal. And if you change their mind, great. They send you a letter that says you win asylum. But that doesn't happen very often. It's very hard to change their minds at this stage. And if you have not changed their mind or you don't reply at all, they send you a final denial letter. It says your claim is denied and nothing else happens. You don't get asylum. That claim is gone. It's done with. You've been denied. But they don't try to put you in deportation proceedings. They don't kick you out, and you keep your status that you have at that moment. And so, you may still have some time left in your tourist stay or a student visa. You just keep on having that status. Okay. Now, if at the moment they make the decision, a negative decision, you do not have legal status, or after you reply to a notice of intent to deny, they look again at that moment and say, okay, now what is your status when they're making the negative decision? And if you don't have legal status, then they do send your case to immigration court where the government is trying to deport you. You get to present your case anew before the immigration judge, and the judge decides whether you get asylum. But you don't want to be in that position because you're one step closer to being deported. So it's not good. Okay. So that's what happens. Thanks for asking. Where are you guys at, by the way? Let me know where you're at. I like to see where folks are watching from. Yeah, nice. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Mohammed is asking, do they give you the result on the spot, like at the interview? No, they don't, Mohammed. They do not. In normal times, outside of the COVID pandemic or before the COVID pandemic, what happens next depends on, or how you get your decision depended on whether a couple of things, but the main thing was if you lived sort of nearby, you had to come back in and pick it up like 2 weeks later. On 2 weeks later, you had to come in and they would hand you your decision in a letter. But if you live farther away, I think it was like 350 miles, at least that was the rule at the Houston Asylum office where I worked, then they would mail it to you. Now it's all mail outs. It's all mail. So no one's coming back in to get their decision letter. Rather, they're going to mail it to you by post. And it's going to take at least a couple of weeks, very often several more, and maybe much longer sometimes. Okay. All right. So this is a good question. Kervin Seidel. Kervin, where are you from? Where is Seidel from? It sounds maybe like Uzbek, but Kervin doesn't sound Uzbek. Anyway, he asks, what is the weight of country conditions during the decision-making process? So for those of you that don't know, country conditions information refers to reports, like reports from U.S. government bodies like the U.S. Department of State, which I actually also used to work at. Before I was an asylum officer, I was a diplomat with the U.S. Department of State, and that's a great job. And so reports by government agencies, reports by non-governmental organizations, reports from, news reports as well. Basically, reports from credible, reputable sources that tell us about what's going on in the country. So how helpful are these or how much do they matter in making the decision? Well, they can matter a lot. Really, the most important thing is, first of all, is what has happened to you, and is there something in particular in your specific experience that's already happened that could be persecution or that suggests that you're going to be persecuted in the future? And if something really bad has happened to you, you can win asylum without the need to rely on, or without these country conditions mattering really at all. In some cases, especially if it's the government that has done the bad thing to you. But where country conditions can really be important and be critical, like absolutely required to be in your favor for you to win, would be a couple of examples would be, so if you fear people who are not from the government, private actors like a gang or just some random people or whatever, people who do not work with and aren't directly supported by the government, then you have to show that the government in your country is unable or unwilling to control the feared persecutor. In other words, you have to show that the government can't or doesn't want to try to help you, is basically what that boils down to. And if you've gone to the police 5 times in 5 different cities and begged for help, and they say, forget you, we don't want to help you. Well, then you might not need a lot of country conditions information to support that proposition. But if not, what you do to convince the officer that the government cannot help you or will not help you is you cite country conditions information reports that say, look, the government, this is a huge problem. This thing that's happening to you is a huge problem in the country, and the government is completely overwhelmed, and they just cannot stop this kind of political violence or religious violence or whatever. They're just, the bad guys are no match for the government, and they cannot stop it. That's an example of country conditions information making a big difference. With regard to this question of, is the government unable or unwilling to control the feared persecutor when the persecutor is not a government actor? Okay. And then another example of where country conditions information is really crucial is if no one has ever really harmed you, and no one's threatened you, and there's no reason to believe that there's someone back in your country who is like actively planning to hurt you when you get back, you're not on someone's list, then you can win asylum still, despite that, by showing that persecution in your country is really bad, really pervasive. It happens all the time to people who fit your profile. And that's called getting asylum, where there's what's called a pattern or practice of persecution of similarly situated persons on account of a protected ground. So here's an example. In Iran, there's a lot of people that get asylum. Well, there's a lot of people in the United States from Iran who get asylum because they change religions or they stop being a Muslim, and they'll often get asylum even though no one's ever threatened them, and people in their country might not even know that now they're a Christian or now they're a Buddhist or whatever. But they still get asylum because there exists in Iran a pattern or practice of persecution of people who renounce Islam. How do we know that? Well, we know that from country conditions information. Also, you'll see country conditions information referred to, in my videos at least, as country of origin information, COI, country of origin information. That's the name that's even more commonly used, I would say, at the asylum office than country conditions information, country of origin information. I was close, Kervin. Turkmenistan. I guessed Uzbekistan. Yeah, I haven't been there. I've been to Uzbekistan for a couple months, which was great. But I'd like to make it out to Turkmenistan. I know a little bit about it. I know about your history with Turkmenbashi. So yeah, a country that's not without its problems. Thanks, Samson, for joining us from Fresno. He says he's Ethiopian from Fresno. Yeah, I've had Ethiopian clients, and I had Ethiopian cases when I was an asylum officer with the government. Okay, unfortunately, my time is short today. I've got to go in just a couple of minutes. And I want to get to one more question. So Yazan says he had an interview on February 25th or February 15th, 2022. I still haven't received a decision. Is this fine? Yeah, don't worry about it. It's normal. What are we now? March 28th? Yeah, we're only a little over a month out. That's normal. It takes that long all the time. If you get to 2 months, I think it's appropriate to send an email to the asylum office and say, hey, just wanted to check on the status of my case. Let me know if there's any other information you need from me. I'll be happy to provide it. Yeah, then yeah. So no, you're just over a month now waiting. Not a problem. Oh, I want to address Adele's question. But before I do that, Adele, if you guys are watching this, whether you're watching it live with me now or watching it after the fact, if you find this stuff helpful, what I'm sharing in this video, or if you think anything that I've put in any of my other videos has been helpful, then I would be really grateful if you would consider leaving me a Google review. It helps me. It helps people to find me. It helps me and my law firm, and it helps people who need help to find us. So if you don't mind taking just a second If you think I provided value, I'd appreciate it if you leave a 5-star review and a sentence or two about what it is that we helped you with or how you found it helpful. I'd appreciate it. I'm going to post a link to that where you can go to leave the Google review, both on YouTube and Facebook. I'm posting that link. So click on it, and if you have a second, I'd be grateful. So last thing is, I've gotten this question several times recently, or some version of it, so I want to address it. Adele says, how about staying in the U.S. because of homeschooling? I'm in the USA seeking asylum. In Sweden, it's illegal to homeschool. They don't have any Torah keeping schools, which we believe in. So, yeah. So no. First of all, unfortunately, I don't think you're going to win asylum. And believe me, I totally understand your concern, and I wish. I think you should be able to, have your children attend a religious school of your choice. But I don't think you're going to win asylum. The first thing is it's Sweden. And when the U.S. asylum officer sees that someone's coming from a country that is developed and, quote unquote, nice, that they think of as like, oh, that's a nice, rich country, especially in Europe, then they're just immediately going to be like, what? Why are you asking for asylum? It's nice there. You're fine there. So that's a big hurdle you have to get over. It's not impossible to get over that hurdle, but it's hard. But in this case, specifically, when you're asking a question about, can you get asylum if you're not allowed to homeschool in a religious home, or you're not allowed to they don't have any religious schools that you want to send your kids to, that you could send your kids to in that country. And so you want to homeschool, but they won't let you. Would this be religious persecution on account of your religion? No, because there's a difference between, the government here, the asylum officer is probably going to think that the government of Sweden is not going out of its way to target Muslims. It's not going out of its way to target really any religion, or even probably all religious people. Well, the most important thing here is that this rule that says you have to send your kids to school, and at school we're not teaching any religion, it's just secular school, and you have to send your kids to it. Everyone has to send their kids to school. You can't just stay home and teach them in your own homeschool, even if it's because you want to do it for religious reasons. Well, that rule operates equally to everyone. Like they're not doing it just to Muslims. I assume, let me know if I'm wrong and they are. That would be messed up, right? And that could be persecution on account of protected ground. If they're targeting a rule against a certain class of people, like a certain religion. But if it's not aimed at someone and it doesn't have the result of disproportionately affecting a certain group, like a certain religion, but rather it applies equally to everyone, then you're not going to win asylum, almost certainly. Okay. Because then it's the enforcement and like the bad things that could happen as a result of you not following those rules would be considered prosecution and not persecution. And there's a difference between those two things. So that's how that works. I have to go. Unfortunately, this was a short run, but I wanted to get on and talk about that first, last, worst framework. I've been thinking about it a lot lately, and it came up today with a potential client, and so I wanted to tell you guys a few words about that. Oh, okay, that's interesting. Oh, Torah. Sorry, I thought you said Quran. So Adele says we're Torah, so we're not Muslims. Okay, so you're not Muslims, but it doesn't change my analysis. Analysis is exactly the same. Ed, so could that be formulated as a particular social group? For example, or this one, parents who cannot homeschool their children in country X. Nope, it's not going to work. I don't think it's going to meet the 3-part test to be a viable particular social group, because you're gonna fail. To get a little bit technical, Ed, which it sounds like you probably know what you're talking about with this stuff. You're going to fail the social distinction test. I mean, well, it depends on the country. Maybe you can find some good country of origin information to make a decent argument along these grounds. But at first blush, it sounds to me like pretty much anywhere, any country, you're going to fail the social distinction test, because you're not going to find a lot of support for the proposition that, look, parents who can't homeschool their children in this country is a thing that everyone, not everyone, but in general, society looks at them and says, oh, it's one of them. It's one of those people, one of those parents who can't homeschool their children. Um, it's going to be hard to find COI showing that society views these people as a distinct group of people, that they are socially distinct within the society. And beyond that, you still have the problem that I talked about earlier of persecution. It's not enough. I mean, even if you convince the officer that this is a valid PSG, you still have to convince him that there's persecution, or that what's going on or what will go on is persecution. And the officer is going to call this prosecution for any, to the extent that there's harm being done for, a parent who chooses to defy the law, the rule, that's going to, and they get punished because of it. That harm is going to be considered prosecution and not persecution. All right. Okay. Got to go. Thank you. And I'll be on live again very soon. And I look forward to engaging with you. If you have a second, I really appreciate that 5-star review on Google. Just click on that link I posted to both Facebook and YouTube a couple of minutes ago. Thanks, and keep leaving comments, and I'll get back to them and answer them later. Thanks, everyone. Have a good one. And as always, it's our honor to serve you in your immigration journey. And give us a call if you want to talk to us and see if we might be able to help you to secure your future in the United States through Asylum. I'm Brian Manning. Thank you.